Hey everybody, it's another majestic INFJ with a new video. Today, while I'm driving and doing some traveling here, I just wanted to do a little bit of a riff, I guess, on the polar function and the sociotics and MBTI typology world. Before I get too far into it, though, I like to preface these videos by warning you that, I sort of assume you have a basic knowledge of the various cognitive functions and how they apply or stack up to the various MBTI or sociotics types. So, if you're still looking for background information on that, at a very high basic level, there's plenty of videos on the internet that you can check out. But assuming you've got sort of a basic knowledge of how they work, then this might be a video for you. So the polar function. So the polar function is what they call the path of least resistance, or POLR. Standing for polar, and it's a function in every MBTI type that's thought of as sort of the blind spot function, or the function that's sort of the weakest and uses the fewest amount of, I would say, or attracts the fewest amount of attentional resources. So if you think of the various functions as your attentional spotlight, sort of focusing on different types of cognitive processes, this is your polar function is probably where the spotlight is the weakest, or the dimmest light. And I think there's a pretty good reason for that. I mean, this is a little bit of theory, but I think it's backed up by a lot of the cognitive science and neuroscience out there. And that has to do with one function inhibiting another function, right? So I would argue that your polar function is somehow being inhibited by another function that you're using a little bit more and attracting more resources, attentional resources to it. So I'll give you plenty of examples here, but think of it as not so much of a deficiency or an inability to do something, but more of just sort of, if you require your consciousness to focus some sort of attentional spotlight on a process, something's hogging that spotlight and making it dimmer for your polar function and harder to sort of bring into consciousness and focus on. So when we talk about the polar function, I mean, we tend to fall in the trap of saying, hey, if you're polar, you can't do this, or you're unable to do blah blah blah. And I would say in most cases it's not really a matter of whether you can or can't do something, but more of how much attention do you have to designate to it, and to sort of get the engine revving. And I think just being human, we all try to find more efficient ways to use our brain resources, and so I think we just sort of redirect anything that has to be processed by your polar function. We try to redirect it to another function to basically save on mental resources. So that's sort of a high level description of where I'm getting at, but we have to sort of dive deeper into the some examples of different functions and how this all plays out. Okay, so in one of my other videos, I explained how if you look at the TE function and the FE function, got competing brain systems that are very close together. They're both sort of located in the frontal lobe, and they are responsible for what the cognitive psychologists call executive function. Now you've got the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is sort of like your main executive function. So, doing complex tasks like driving a car or, washing the dishes, things like that. But it's really when you first start doing it, and you have to figure out what the process is, right? I have to figure out, okay, first I do this, then I do this, then I do this, right? I do step 1, then I do step 2, then I do step 3. And eventually your brain, and this has been shown for years and years, decades now, eventually your brain sort of converts all that information into autopilot, right? And so when you're driving a car, you don't really have to think about it. You don't have to think, do step 1, do step 2, do step 3, unless something comes along and interferes with your general process, right? Like if there's a bike behind your car as you're backing up out of the driveway, now all of a sudden you have to, focus your attention on that executive function and sort of redirect your processing route, right? So in the TE world, and in particular, think of it as a cognitive function that's figuring out a new process, and it could be either figuring out a new process or maybe mentally tinkering with an existing process to see if you can figure out how to make it easier, shorter, more efficient, that kind of thing. But the point is that it's conscious, right? You have to actually think about it and think about, okay, which steps am I going to take here, and what's the linear order of things, right? The other important thing to keep in mind is that this is goal-oriented, right? So your executive function kicks in when you have some sort of goal in mind. And so if you're just sort of passively watching TV or listening to the radio, or, sitting by the pool, sitting by the beach, as long as you're not trying to figure out how to do something, your TE is going to be kind of just shut off, right? And then as soon as you encounter something where it's more goal-oriented, and you have to figure out the various steps, then your TE is going to turn on, or this executive function is going to turn on, okay? So I think that sort of over-explains what I'm getting at. So that's TE, and again, you have a brain circuitry that's very, very well established. They see this in fMRIs, and they see it in ERP studies, and then various neurological patients that have damage to that area. They've really figured out, okay, this is the area of the brain that does this systematic executive function. And then right underneath it, or maybe to the side of it, is your medial prefrontal cortex, medial lateral prefrontal cortex, maybe, and that is more responsible for social functions. So it's still an executive function area where it's goal oriented, and it's trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B, right? So I've got a goal, and I'm currently in this state, and I want to get to that result. So what do I need to do to get there? And in this area, which I will call more of your social executive function, it has more to do with social behavior. And so you can imagine, instead of well, it can sort of pop up in two different ways. Number one, it can pop up in just if you're dealing with a social situation as opposed to a physical object situation, right? So instead of trying to figure out how to drive your car or how to use your new dishwasher or how to, hook up your stereo system or your new TV, dealing with objects and sort of that sort of process, you're dealing more with people, right? And so I'm in a new social situation that I've never been into. I just walked into a crowd, a party where I only know a couple of people, and there's like 50 people here who I don't know. How do I deal with this situation? How do I, get to some level of comfort, right? And are you the type that just goes around and introduces yourself to everybody? Are you the type that just sort of stands there and waits for people to come to you? Or are you the type that just sort of hides in the corner and you'd just rather not be bothered by anybody and just find the people that you know and sort of gravitate, cling onto them, right? There's various solutions to this social problem or social situation. And I would argue that that's what that part of the brain is doing, right? And so even though very, very different outcomes, it's still the same cognitive function. It's still FE. You're trying to figure out, how do I deal with this social situation in sort of a goal-oriented way, okay? Same thing for, like, if you're going on a job interview, you have an obvious goal here, right? You want to get the job, and so you're going to be interviewing probably with several people, and they'll be asking you a bunch of questions about yourself and your work history and your education and et cetera, and this is all sort of a social interaction, goal-oriented behavior, okay? Because you're trying to get the job, but you're also trying to impress the people that you're interviewing with, and hopefully getting them to like you or to not like you. And so, again, instead of flipping on your TE, typically, you'd flip on your FE to deal with this sort of situation, okay? So now that's sort of an explanation of two different functions, and you can see how, there's some overlap there, but in general, they're working in different domains, and they're trying to solve different types of problems. And you can just see from an evolutionary perspective why these two systems would come into being and sort of diverge in the way that they did, separate out to handle different types of goal-oriented problems. Okay, so going back to the polar function, what I would argue is that these two systems, if one of them, these two systems inhibit each other, and I wouldn't be surprised, in fact, I'd probably predict that if you look into the science literature, it's been a long time since I was actively involved in this stuff, but I'm sure if you look at the science literature, you're going to find some sort of connections between these systems which are inhibitory, where when one system turns on, it probably inhibits or dampens the other system. So if you're in a TE frame of mind and you're trying to solve a TE type of problem, right, then like fixing your car engine or something, then you're going to dampen down the social function, and vice versa. If you're sort of in a social domain situation that you're trying to solve, then a lot of times you're going to dampen down the TE. But when it comes to the polar function, I'd argue that your brain is just sort of so used to dampening down one of the systems that it tries to compensate and solve the problem using the other system. So let me give the example that I've been giving before. If your car tire blows, knock on wood, that won't happen to me here, but if you get a flat tire on the highway and you've never had to change a flat tire, right? Nobody's ever explained to you how to do it. You've never had to do it yourself. And now all of a sudden you're in a situation where you've got to figure out what to do with this flat tire situation, okay? If you want to engage your TE, then, or let me put it a different way. If you decide, okay, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm going to change the tire, and I'm a pretty industrious person, and I think I can figure it out, then that's sort of a TE domain situation where, you've got this physical system and a linear pathway that you need to take to get from your flat tire to your changed tire, okay? And you've got to figure out the steps along the way and which tools to use, and you can't really skip from step 1 to step 2, right? You don't take the tire off before you jack up the car, that kind of seemingly obvious stuff, right? But when you're using your TE, you've got to figure out what that order is, okay? Take somebody else who maybe isn't as comfortable using their TE, and let's just say all things are they're equally strong. This isn't a matter of physical strength or inability there, but what they would rather do is, rather than spending the mental resources figuring out how to change this tire, because again, they've never had to do it before, nobody's ever told them how to do it, they'd rather just spend the mental resources finding somebody to help, right? So who can I call that will come out here and help me change this tire? Who's got sort of, and so it's sort of the social processing, right? Number one, it's got to be somebody Number two, whoever this is has to have the sort of know-how and the ability to change the tire. So you have to sort of assess, the various people that and number three, it's got to be somebody who's going to be willing to help you, or at least somebody that you can convince to come out and help you on such short notice. And so there's a lot of dynamics there, right? And there's a lot of sort of weighing out your options and doing sort of what we would call a factor analysis in the statistics world, where who's sort of when you sort of put all those factors together, who do I know who has these skills, who would be willing to come out and help me. You sort of weight all those and you figure out, okay, Jack, my friend, good old Jack, he's a car mechanic and he's my best friend and he owes me a couple of favors. And you factor all that stuff in and you come up with the result of Jack. And then you might have a second option. If Jack's not available, then maybe Jill. Jill's pretty good with cars, and she's usually willing to help a friend in a bind, that kind of thing. Okay, so now you can see you went from a TE type of problem to an FE type of problem, and you still have to do some mental processing, right? I mean, this isn't just if you decide to get somebody else to help you with, change the tire, that actually might be more difficult, right? So it's not necessarily you being lazy or anything, because it might be a hell of a lot more difficult to find somebody to help you than to just do it yourself, right? But if you're sort of a predominant FE user, you just sort of frame the problem in this way, maybe. Okay, now, all that being said, again, if you, don't take this as being is me saying, if you're an FE user, you're incapable of figuring out how to change the tire. That's not the case at all. I think an FE user might decide, they might decide, well, it's really not worth it. I could probably figure this out myself, and then they would just go and use their TE to try to solve it. But the point of it is, what's sort of your natural reaction? Where does your mind first go? Where does that attentional spotlight first focus on? Focus your attention. And again, if you're FE, you sort of think of, how can I solve this through a social solution? If you're TE, you sort of more likely go immediately to the problem. Okay, so again, how does this have to do with POLR? Well, POLR, again, take a little bit of a sidestep here and explain where the POLR shows up in your functional stack. So your POLR is going to be the opposite direction of your third function, okay? So if you're an INFJ and your third function is TI, then your POLR function is going to be TE, okay? Another way to think about it is the POLR function is the corresponding function to your secondary function. So if your secondary function, like an INFJ, is FE, then the corresponding function is going to be TE, right? So you find, if your second function is a judging function like feeling, then it's going to be, your POLR function will be the other judging function pointed in the same direction, right? So if your second function is FE, your POLR function will be TE. If your second function is FI, your POLR function will be TI, okay? Now, the reason, and this is sort of my argument here, finally, we're getting to it, I guess. The reason that you've got this POLR function, I would argue, is because you spend so much of your attentional resources on your second function that it inhibits the corresponding function. And so going back to FE and TE, where we know there's actually different brain pathways guiding or supporting or underlying these two functions. And again, I would argue, if you sort of scour through the literature, you're probably going to find some literature out there where people have found cortical pathways between the two systems where they actually inhibit each other in one way or another. And so if your second function is FE, then you're probably using FE, to so much and to such an extent that your brain just sort of naturally inhibits TE. And it takes a lot of attentional resources and sort of probably willpower to some extent to get those TE engines revving, right? And to shine that spotlight, that attentional spotlight on that function in a way to where, it's not just sort of flickering and dim, and it actually, pops up and turns on. And because of that, it probably has to inhibit, your TE would have to inhibit your FE, and, that is probably not as strong of an inhibitory path because you don't use that path as much, right? And so, brain pathways are all about the more you use it, the stronger it gets. And so the more your FE is inhibiting your TE, then it just sort of snowballs and gets to the point where it gets harder for your TE to inhibit your FE. So think about it that way. So that's sort of in a nutshell, a very long nutshell, but hopefully it made sense, of where your polar function is coming from. It's not just sort of some mystical thing that comes out of nowhere, or has to do with numerology or anything like that. I would argue that every polar function is the result of some sort of inhibitory process where you are so adept and used to using your second function, and it hogs up so much of your attentional resources, and you know there's probably some sort of inhibitory pathways between your second function and your polar function that just over time, it's just sort of dampen that function out. And it takes a lot of energy to overcome it. Okay? So let's sort of flip through some of the other MBTI types and see how this polar can sort of manifest itself, because I've pretty much just been using this FETE relationship, and a lot of that is because it's so clear in the neuroscience field or neuroscience area that you have these two opposite pathways, that it's easy to explain and get the point across. Okay, so let's think about maybe some other polar functions. And so let's think of the other judging functions, right? So, like I said, if your second function is FI and your polar function is going to be TI, right? And so if you're, who are we dealing with here? ESFPs and sorry, hard to think and drive at the same time, right? So who are we dealing with that are TI and polar? ENFPs have their secondary function is extroverted feeling, or introverted feeling, so they're going to be TI polar, and then ESFPs will also be TI polar. Okay, so ENFPs and ESFPs are TI polar types because their second function is FI, right? So they're going to be spending a lot of energy using their FI, and it's going to somehow inhibit their TI to the point to where they would rather just sort of solve things using an FI framework. And then you also see it in the other direction. So if somebody has TI as their second function, so somebody like an ENTP or an ESTP, they're going to have TI as their second function and FE as their polar function. Or I'm sorry, FI is their polar function. Sorry. So, again, if their TI system is being used so much and so much attentional resources being shifted there, then it dampens down their corresponding function. TI is going to dampen down FI. Okay. So, how might this play out? So if you're a FI polar, and, well, first of all, let's sort of think about in broad strokes what FI and TI are essentially doing, and what do they share in common, and how are they different, right? So in the same way that we talked about TE and FE both being associated with goal-oriented behavior, but in different domains, I would argue FI and TI sort of have, an overall function that's similar, but it works in different domains. And what I would argue is that what they're both trying to do is actively parse out and characterize or maybe categorize the world. Okay, so or information that's coming in about the world. And I would say it's sort of an active, here and now kind of process. So, diving a little deeper. So, the TI, what it's doing is it's parsing out information that comes in and it's trying to figure out if it's logically valid. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if the information is true, but whether or not it's logically valid, right? So, an example would be if you had this stream of information coming in and you hear all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles, okay? And Sherry is a dog, so is Sherry a poodle? Or somebody might say Sherry is a poodle. And what your TI is trying to do is figure out whether or not that's a valid conclusion, right? So TI and FI are sort of making conclusions or determinations about the world and the information that's coming in. And TI is trying to figure out whether or not the information you're receiving is valid in a logical sense, and it's following the rules of logic, right? Just like maybe a computer operating system would, where you can input any symbol, right? So it's like symbolic logic. You can input any symbol, and it's really the relationship among them, and then the conclusions you draw, of whether or not those conclusions are valid or not, right? So, again, using my example, all poodles are dogs, but not all dogs are poodles. Sherry is a dog, so Sherry is a poodle. Now, your TI should immediately be blinking and saying, no, that's not valid. Sherry might be a poodle, but not necessarily. And so I'm going to need more information before I make this determination and before I categorize Sherry, right? Put her in her little logical semantic box, right? So in cognitive science and neuroscience and whatnot, we refer to this as sort of semantic learning. Information that, is sort of, categories of, is it a bird, is it a dog, is it a tree, is it a plant, is it a human, is it a planet, is it a rock, is it a car, is it, all that kind of, categorization and typology and all that kind of stuff has to be put into some framework, and you do it through this logical processing, right? So if you're trying to figure out what Sherry is, in my example, well, she's a dog, and we know that poodles are dogs, so she might be a poodle, right? It's more likely she's a poodle than an ostrich, right? And so your brain is going to sort of put Sherry towards the dog side of your categories and further away from the bird side. But we don't necessarily know that she's a poodle until we get more information, right? And then you just sort of work through various iterations, and then eventually you'll find a logical conclusion that Sherry, is a poodle, or maybe you determine that she's a beagle, or some other type of dog, right? But it's through this logical iteration, step-by-step process, as you get more information and process it, you start putting things in different buckets and different categories, right? And then also, you're just sort of doing this in real time. If somebody's telling you that, such and such is the case, and they're trying to argue with you that, people from Iceland are the smartest people in the world, and they'll say, something like, most people from Iceland are, score higher than a 1600 on their SAT, and scoring higher than a 1600 makes you a smart person, so therefore Icelanders are the smartest. But okay, they might have a big group of people who do, but there could be another group of people out there that score even higher, or maybe not as many do, but the few that do score significantly higher, etc., right? You see where I'm going with this. So you're getting in new information about the world all the time, and your TI has to parse it out and figure out whether it makes logical sense, and then also figure out, well, how do I characterize it? Where do I put this in my semantic knowledge base based off of the information I've received, because I've sort of checked various boxes to determine that it's valid information, or a valid way to characterize this thing, and so it's sort of stored away that way. Okay? Alright, and before all the comments start coming up that that's SI, I have a completely different explanation of what SI is. Trust me, that's what TI is it's the logical parsing out, and then based off of the sort of determinations you make on your logic, you start categorizing things based off of sort of their semantic properties or meaning. Okay? We'll get into SI and NI later. Okay, so your TI is doing that. It's doing it on a very logical, symbolic logic. Is it valid? Is it not valid? Kind of routines over and over and over and over and over again. Okay? And your FI is very different, right? So if you think of your TI as being sort of a digital, systematic type of process, right? It's not like TE, where it's very ordinal and step by step, but it is digital in the sense that you sort of parse things out using different data chunks of information or different symbols of information. Okay? FI is also doing this sort of characterization thing about, whether or not something, what do I conclude about this new information that I just got, right? But it's doing it on a much more, what I would argue, analog kind of way. It's deciding, do I like this thing? Does this thing have value to me? Or does it not have value to me? Or do I not like this thing, right? So typically, if something doesn't have value to you, you're more likely to not like it, and especially if it has sort of what I would refer to as negative value. In other words, it can hurt you, or have negative benefits, then, that clearly has negative value on the FE scale. So, again, FE is not parsing things out and operating any sort of symbolic logic and trying to figure out whether something is validly the case or not, right? It's not trying to figure out, is Sherry a poodle based off of the information it has. Let me back up. Really what it's doing is it's trying to figure out, do I like Sherry? Does Sherry have any value to me? Or does Sherry pose a threat to me, right? Where she has negative value. And think of it sort of in the evolutionary scheme, right? Where way back when, our ancestors who might not have been as cognitively advanced as we are, they still had a system in their brain and in their cognitive map and schema of whether or not something's a threat or whether or not something's good and beneficial to them, right? So if they see something moving, a little small thing moving in the forest, then their value system might spike up and say, ooh, that could be beneficial to me, because typically little small things running around can be food, like rabbits and squirrels or whatever. They would eat back then. But if it's a big thing running around in the forest, and and they hear it and they see it, and it sounds bigger and looks bigger, then again, now it's a threat, and so their FI system is going to start signaling danger, danger. We've got a threat. Now, does the brain care about whether or not this thing is a rabbit versus a squirrel versus, a deer? Or, is it, does it care if it's a lion or a leopard or a tiger? Not really, right? I mean, what it cares about is whether or not the thing poses a threat or not, or whether or not the thing might be beneficial. And for you TI users out there, yes, I know deer can be kind of big, so yeah, it might be seen as a threat, or it might be seen as a benefit. Somebody's got to figure it out. But you can see where I'm getting at, right? Where you've got an FI system that doesn't really care about the logic underlying anything. It doesn't care about whether something is valid or invalid. What it cares about is this thing beneficial to me, or is it a threat to me? Is it more likely to be food and helpful, or is it more likely to be a predator and dangerous? Okay? And so that's a very simple way of thinking about it. And so now let's think about polar, this in the polar context, right? So if you're a heavy FI user, and you're going around the world and you're sort of characterizing and drawing conclusions about the world and various information that's coming in based off of your FI, is this thing beneficial to me, or is it dangerous to me? Is it a cost or a benefit? That kind of thing. Then you can imagine that system tampering down or inhibiting your logical system, because your logical system is trying to figure out what exactly it is, right? Not so much of is it a threat? Does it pose value to me or not? I mean, in some abstract way, you eventually get there, right? But in the here and now, as we're sort of just walking around in the world and this random information is coming into us, if you're a heavy TI user and there's a tiger, or let's put it this way, if you got two people walking in the forest, and one of them's one of them has FI as their second function, so they're a heavy FI user, and one of them has TI as their second function, they're a heavy TI user, who do you think's going to survive if those two people run into the tiger? Most likely, I mean, not necessarily all the time, but most likely, the heavy FI user is going to survive, right? Because they're immediately going to sense, okay, that is danger. I don't care what it is. I don't care why it's danger. All I know is I get this FI sense that that's danger, and I'm out of here, right? And so they take off a lot sooner. And then you got the TI guy there who has, maybe a suppressed FI system. And he's looking at it, he's trying to figure out what it is, right? and it's not until he realizes, oh shit, that's a tiger and not a deer or a rabbit, that by that time it's too late, right? And so you could see why these two systems would inhibit each other, right? And, we could probably come up with an example of, why, situations where it'd be more beneficial to have your TI turned on in suppressing your FI, right? And, you know, I mean, it's really just if your FI is on too much, you know, or if you rely too much on your FI, you could have two sorts of problems. You could have either you kind of have type 1 errors and type 2 errors, right? Where you start things could fool you into you thinking that it's a benefit when it's really a danger, right? So it could be like a berry or something where if your brain sort of thinks like all red things are good and sweet and are food, then you know, you're more likely to get duped by some sort of poisonous berry that's red, and you just sort of assume, oh, well, it's red, I'm going to eat it, and without logically thinking it through, right? Where somebody with TI, and if it's poisonous, then you might die off, right? But somebody with TI, you know, where they might be suppressing their FI, they might look at it and say, okay, well, what is this thing really, right? I mean, yes, most red things are good and food and provide some benefit, but not all red things. And so I got to figure out, is this, you know, and so it's not valid to say that all red things are food and edible and provide a benefit. And because it's not valid, I'm going to sort of try to get more information here, right? So I'll feed it to my dog and see if my dog throws up, or I'll sit around and watch the FI user and see if the FI user eats it. And if the FI user eats it and dies, then I know, okay, not all red things are food and should be eaten, right? So, again, you can see why, just from a survival and evolutionary perspective, you can have these two systems interacting with each other and one dampening down the other. Now, of course, in any sort of healthy human being, you're going to have both systems working and, you know, counterbalancing each other. But being human and being flawed, we tend to skew, well, those of us who have one of them in our polar slots, you tend to skew towards one over the other, okay? And you might try to make something that is sort of an FI domain into a TI domain, right? And vice versa. And so, you know, you see this a lot in sort of arguments about pop culture and musicians and stuff, and people will try to use TI arguments when it's really sort of an FI thing, right? Where, you know, you're at the bar and you're having an argument about who's the best band. Is it Tool? Is it Radiohead? Is it Rush? Is it, you know, just pick whatever band you want to defend here. And we all know in sort of our heart of hearts that this is just your opinion. This is just people's opinion. You know, same thing when people are trying to do the Mount Rushmore for the best NBA players ever, right? Is it LeBron James and Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan, and who's that fourth? You know, is it Larry Bird? Is it Bill Russell? You know, everybody tries to make different arguments, and so we all know that it's really basically just an FE type of thing. It's a value-based judgment that a lot of different factors are going into. But but again, they'll try to shift it into the TI domain and say, well, this guy had more rebounds and this guy had more, points and blah, 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 blah. And they try to reduce it down to stats, and then it just becomes a question of which stat do you value, right? Do you value points per game? Do you value number of championships? Do you value, the length of the person's career? All this other stuff, like, clearly the stats are going to differentiate the players, but the stats themselves are meaningless because because you have to assign a value to which stat is the most important. And if it's Super Bowl rings or NBA championship rings, fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to agree with that, right? Some people still are going to argue that LeBron is a better player than Michael Jordan, even if he didn't have as many rings, right? Or better than Kobe, even if he doesn't end up with as many rings, because he did this, and had all these other stats. And then you're just sort of figuring out what the value of those stats are, right? So you can see how in the FI and TI domains, you do this, domain shifting all the time without really knowing it, right? And if you're sort of FI polar, these are all the guys on ESPN, all your ENFPs and ESFPs that just sit there and argue all day about, who's the better player and who's on the Mount Rushmore, and it just gets so tiring because none of them can agree on which stat or which criteria is the most important, right? Because that's an FI decision, right? And so they're, I'm sorry, I used the wrong example. It's not the ESFP, it's the ENTPs and whatnot that are sort of the FI polar, but and just sort of try to shift everything into the stats domain. So the ESTPs and the ENTPs, and so you probably got a lot of ESTPs, as your sort of sportscaster, sports analysis types. Okay, so I think that's probably a pretty good place to stop for right now. Ferreting out the FI and the TI and how they could inhibit each other, and the FE and the TE and how they could inhibit each other, and how this gives rise to your polar function or other people's polar functions, depending on their type. And then it also sort of helps as you're doing this as you're learning MBTI and learning how to read people and go through sort of a personality analysis or typing, really the best way is to figure out what their polar function is. And that's a lot easier said than done. I mean, I would argue you probably have to, to really know, you have to have them go through some sort of test, like, or session, like, talking with famous people, or host Eric does. He's the only one I'm aware of that does it this way. I apologize if there's other people out there who do it this way, but he's the only person I know of that does it this way, where he focuses on the polar, figures out what's your polar, and then sort of works from there. And he does this by sort of systematically testing the various areas, right? But as you're sort of, going around in the world and just loosely trying to type, what do you think Joe Rogan is, or what do you think LeBron James is, or whatever, try to figure out what their polar is. I'd actually probably argue Joe Rogan's TI polar, so he's probably ESFP or ENFP. I think he's TI polar, but I'll explain that in another video maybe. But watch anything where somebody's trying to explain cryptocurrency to them, and you could just see a brick wall go up, and his eyes just glaze over more so than they usually do, and you can just tell that, like, his brain does not feel like going into TI world and processing this stuff. So anyways, that's my quick analysis, and that is what I would encourage those of you who are obsessed with this kind of stuff and want to type people. Don't focus on what they're good at. because people can fool you very, very easily. And they can, people who are, INTJs that are FE POLR or whatever, INTJs could, with their third function being FI, they can come across as very sort of, I don't want to say emotional, but very opinionated, and and it comes across as sort of feeling versus thinking, and same for an INFP. Their FI is just like so strong that it almost comes across as logical in a way, right? Like they're so in tune with whether something is beneficial or not beneficial that they can sort of make up these arguments and have conversations where they're really talking about their opinion on things, but it makes so much sense that you sort of feel like they're making a logical argument to you, right? Where like they're sort of identifying some truth, not in an I type, but coming to like some conclusion that we all should sort of come to. And you see this a lot in sort of ethical philosophers like Peter Singer, a bunch of the other ones that are sort of popular these days. I mean, maybe to some extent even like Jordan Peterson, somebody like that, where they're really just giving you their opinion on things and how things ought to be, but they do it in such a convincing and well thought out way that it comes across as them making a logical argument as more than an ethical argument, right? In the sense that like it seems objective and that like nobody can deny it, right? That it's got to be the case, even though they're really just giving you their opinion and what their values are. Now, that's not to say everything is opinion. I mean, they do. They'll give you facts, and they'll give you statistics, and they'll give you all that stuff to sort of back things up. But, a large part of their arguments and a large part of their thesis is more ethics-based than logic-based. But you still come away thinking, wow, this person's really smart, and they really know their stuff, and, convinced me. But, they did it in more of an FI analysis kind of way, right? And so when you first get into typology and sort of trying to type people, you do sort of fall into that trap where people can make ethical arguments, like everything on CNN and Fox News and all that, that's all ethical arguments. There's very, very little logical in the true sense of the word, symbolic logic coming up with valid versus invalid results. It's all just sort of opinion and value-based ethics arguments. And it's not to say that they're not useful. They're definitely useful. And it's not to minimize them, and I'm not trying to say that they're trying to be one thing but they're not, or that they're phony or anything like that. I think it's just you have to understand the difference between what's an ethical argument and a logical argument. And sometimes an outsider who sees a heavy FI user like a INFP or maybe an ISFP, they might come across as very, very logical, but really it's very, very ethical, and they've thought through the ethics and they've thought through the values in a way that you probably haven't, unless you're one of them. So anyways, sorry, that was sort of a tangent. Maybe we can get into some more on that in another video, but I'm just sort of freewheeling it here while driving. So hopefully this was helpful and helps you in your typology journey. And figuring all this stuff out. Happy to discuss. Feel free to leave a comment and do the whole liking and subscribing thing. And I will talk to you later.